So the reason I wanted to talk to everyone here is it's a big undertaking that you took. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of money and time and effort that everybody put into this, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were about now that it's finished, how successful it was, the things that you learned along the way, things that you didn't expect, and just also try and audit how receptive Ottawa was of your thoughts and concerns.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background at the beginning. There was a, we live we have two homes, one in Bamfield, which is right on the west coast of Vancouver Island at the mouth of Barkley Sound. And it's a small community, about 200 full-time residents. And we've lived there for 10 years in the 80s. And then uh, when we moved into the larger town, we kept the little place that we had there. And so it's sort of our spiritual home retreat place. It's a very beautiful, nature retreat. But when we were there in it would have been in April, there was a group of people in Banfield who were writing letters to the government of Canada, basically extending the call for a ceasefire and in Gaza. And they were very concerned, as all of us were. And that was something that they met and wrote physical letters, and then we'd post them, and look for responses. And that was Gord Johns, our MP. Um, he was one of the first 30 of the 35 MPs that signed the letter in November 2023, calling for a ceasefire and asking the government to stop the shipment of arms to Israel. Um, so then, out of that discussion and doing that, we were thinking, well, what else could we do? And after a late night meeting with one of our friends, Jan Teversham, who actually came on the train with us, I woke up in the morning and I had this kind of earworm tune in my head. I was asking myself, what is that? Like, it sounds really familiar, but I was just sort of waking up. And then I realized it was Cat Stevens' Peace Train, 1971. And I quickly went and got it up on YouTube, and it was sort of just like a light went on. It's like, we have to do that. We have to go to Ottawa. That's where these decisions are being made. So it was just sort of a seed of an idea. So that afternoon, I phoned Via Rail, and I said, we want to go on the train. A bunch of us, hopefully, we don't know how many people. We just want to, pick a time that'll work. And they suggested the off-season rate starts at the end of October. And then I started querying them, okay, which train has the most seats available, and which one would work. And in the meantime, I was sending out emails to all of my personal network saying, what do you think of this idea? Does it have legs? Should we do this? Is it a good thing? So just all that feedback from people, John and Diane were totally involved from that process. And the VIA got back to us, and we eventually, between John and Diane and Bernadette and myself, we bought a block of berths on Via Rail, and uh, and then in the intervening, like after that, they've had a major sale on the Via Rail system, and a number of us bought cabins. They were like 40% off for a cabin for two, and um, and then we were scrambling because we knew we needed to have other types of people on the train. So Gordon Matty's our friend in Winnipeg, said, "Hey, you got to talk to John Longhurst. He's a journalist in Winnipeg. He does this, covers this kind of stuff, and we also, we're looking for videographers." So it just kind of flowed from there. And then we ended up with about 20 people with cabins and about 20 people on in berths, so 40 people in total. So that was sort of the mechanical, like I was being the travel agent for 40 people between Via Rail and everyone, and getting that all together. And that was just sort of like more of a technical, housekeeping kind of project. But in the meantime, we are good friends with Kathleen Wallace Deering, who worked with plowshares in the 70s and 80s. Um, so we were really close through university. She's a childhood friend of Bernadette's. And when she was working with plowshares in the 70s and 80s, we really maintained that connection through to peacekeeping. And we were involved in the anti-Trident protests in Bangor in the late 70s, mid to late 70s with Jim and Shelley Douglas and a number of other people. Um, and so we just maintained that connection. So we started back to Kathleen and said, well, who should we be talking to in the peace world? Like all these, giants that we knew about but hadn't really kept up to, in the intervening decades. So we ended up with this advisory committee, which included Ernie Regier, Alex Neve, Doug Roche, Michael Cook, Steve Staples, Peter Longeal, and Walter Dorn. And we just found out that John Longhurst was just inducted into the Order of Canada yesterday. And John was on the train with us. So it turns out that out of our 8 sort of advisors, half of them are Order of Canada inductees. So they've really been vetted in Canada for their contribution to Canadian society. And we found the generosity of spirit among all those people, to kind of really be so helpful and open and willing to advise us to formulate our message in a way that would, be aspirational, but also have some possibility, some kind of political legs, possibly. And so, that was really critical for us because and the other people that we talked to were, just get the name, Jeffrey Wilkinson and Raja Kuri, who wrote the book, The Wall Between Us. And they had published that book just a couple of weeks before October 7th. So that's a Palestinian and a Jew trying to understand how to create a space for dialogue and exchange of goodwill between the two populations. So we were talking to them and also with the Ukraine system, of destruction. We chose to move to first principles rather than focus on emergent issues because it was so fraught. You couldn't actually talk about it. And this is what Raja and Jeffrey were telling us. It's like, if you even bring these issues up, you'll just create a firestorm and it will be very difficult to start talking about peace in that environment that was so fraught and difficult. So we decided to focus on first principles, mainly getting back to the founding intentions of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then people like Doug Roche, of course, he was a hero of the peace and disarmament movement, being a conservative MP and a senator. And then after that, the Canada's ambassador to the UN for disarmament. So these were our we're standing on the shoulders of giants, getting directed or in, the wisdom of their accumulated years for what they had done. So that's really, there was 2 parts of it: the physical part, the symbolism of the train as a national. I guess you'd say, the train united us, but it also we understood the issues around colonialism and how destructive the whole opening of the country was. The train and our indigenous disasters that we, meted out to those people who were swept away so we could build that train. So recognize our own colonial, the logic and the culture of colonialism was part of wrestling with Canada's own history, but then referencing the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People as a small measure to recognize that history and, try to move into a more just society. And then the formation of our goal, which was the establishment of the Center of Excellence for Peace and Justice, where we attach the concept of justice, like that there is no peace without justice, and it's that peace is not it's not the peace of the graveyard where you vanquish the enemy and then you have peace, but because it doesn't actually happen that way, that the power imbalance in these conflicts and the origin of them is largely a justice issue. So that's one of the things we want to continue to focus on, and not just the militarization of conflict, but the understanding of its origins and then developing diplomatic tools to address that rather than the go-to option being first, well, we need to spend, 2 and now talking about 3% of our GDP on light armored vehicles and submarines.
Well, you asked, was there anything surprising about the trip? And, one of the best parts of it for everyone. So we ended up with 40 people. When we started, we had no idea if anybody would join us. It was a bit difficult, very difficult for weeks with no one adhering and trying to get the word out there, and then ended up with 40. Well, that was a surprise. But the biggest surprise was how well everyone, like at least half of us had never met before. And we did a few Zooms before we left. But on the train, it was like a rolling retreat, complete with training on how to dialogue like Raja and Jeffrey are teaching. It's like, how do you dialogue in a really rough situation where people are pressing your buttons and you've got a lot of emotion inside? How do you deal with that? Anyway, the people were so amazing. And what was surprising is, up until when we left, there's so much of yourself and willpower that goes into the design of something like that. But then when you're together, it completely transcends yourself and your will, and this dynamic of people that are willing to actually have agency in the world and connect. It just lifted us up, and it was unpredictable how powerful that was. And just the joy that was in them. Quite a few places we went, if you're looking for success or a lot of people coming out or something to make you feel better about your project, none of that mattered. It didn't matter where we went, and we didn't care who showed up or not showed up. We had this aspiration, and it's mixed with a sense of urgency because of the kind of slaughter that's going on around the world and the polarization. Anyways, to be connected in this kind of, in a different view, in a different application, it was very remarkable, and it just flowed into a really good reception in Ottawa by our political leaders, and it was so rewarding to be with them. And it was a MP, Gord Johns, and his assistant organized all of that, which is huge, to organize a reception like that. But all of the parties attending, which was all of them attending, got up and spoke and shared with each other where they're at or where their hesitation is, but all of them were very grateful that we came to kind of roll the dialogue together.
Well, it was quite a surprise to us when we got to that multi-party reception on the first evening of our arrival in Ottawa, because Gord Johns and his assistant Corinne, they'd put all this time and the funding for the evening and everything, but they said to us in preparation, they said, don't get your hopes up too high. MPs are really busy and they're torn in half a dozen different directions. You'll be lucky if you get 2 or 3 MPs out, but don't worry about it. You're doing your thing. And anyway, we got there that night and we were just overwhelmed. I was standing kind of by the door, and the MPs kept coming in, and they kept coming in, and we'd introduce ourselves to them, and another MP, and it turned out there was 10 MPs and a senator that came that evening. And I mean, we just had this sense that they were really not only receptive, but appreciative of what we were doing. And I think for a lot of us, that evening was probably the highlight of the whole thing. But there were, as Bernadette and Keith have mentioned, there were lots of kind of surprises, that happened. Not the least of which was when Chris and his group turned up, at the Ottawa station with the music, and then they turned out on. I mean, having them on Parliament Hill was one of the best memories I'll ever have. I think being out there by the Peace Flame and having the music and singing and everything, it was great.
Yeah, it is excuse me. You really take it for granted after living here in the city of Ottawa for a number of years that just how special of a place this is, and how it is the center of government and the center of a lot of the decisions to get made all across the country. Something that really struck me with what you said about your approach to talking about the situation and issues going on right now was not to talk so much about emerging issues, but to go back to first principles with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and things like that. And it struck me as kind of like a little bit genius to skirt around the whole polarizing issues of which particular thought you might take on some of these conflicts that are happening right now, and try and break down exactly what we need to be, how we need to care about each other. Really resonated with me.
I think it resonated with the MPs, not only the ones that were at the reception, but also after that, we attended the question period in the House, and Elizabeth May stood up and asked the government, when are you going to fund a peace center? And I think Minister Blair, he never committed to our ask, but what he basically referred to was Canada's past and ongoing commitment to peacekeeping. I mean, the rhetoric is still there, embedded in so many people's minds. The execution is a little bit, lax right now in terms of following through. Sort of right now, it's if you want peace, prepare for war. And we're saying, well, maybe you should try the peace, like prepare for peace. And there's always an option, I guess, at some point where war is maybe inevitable or somewhat justified. I mean, we're not pacifists like in a classical sense, but what we're focusing on the primacy of diplomacy and the primacy of peace, and all these institutions that were built after the horrors of the Second World War, when the leaders, I mean, many of those leaders at that time were veterans. They understood the horror of it and the abhorrent outcomes of war, and they were really struggling and digging deep to try to prevent that from happening again. And we're the fortunate beneficiaries. Our generation didn't have to go and fight in a world war. I mean, it is significant that this approach did keep us in a relatively peaceful, state, at least in our somewhat privileged, North American societies. I mean, there's wars of adventurism that our countries have been involved in. It's not that there was, totally a peaceful time, but the scale was moderated and we benefited from a global approach to diplomacy. So that's sort of what we wanted to focus on. And also now we have NATO, but we're looking at the history of NATO, and then the fundamental principles of NATO was that it was to be under the umbrella of the United Nations. Like the intent was peace. And even that card we sent you was, well, after the events of the peace train project, we went to visit Bernadette's sister for a week, and they live just close to where the Diefenbunker is, out there southwest of Ottawa. So we're down in the bowels of the Diefenbunker, and we come upon this little vignette of NATO and peacekeeping, and here's this Article 2 of the NATO formation, which was basically promoted and insisted upon by Lester Pearson at the time. And Article 2 is basically laying out the intent for peace and development as a goal. And even Article 1 talks about peace being prime. So it's really interesting to go back to even the first principles of NATO and then compare that to, Secretary General Rutte talking about last week. We need a war mindset, advising a war mindset because of the apparent threat.
But I need to interrupt here because Article 2, NATO's Article 2, is called the Canada Clause, because Lester B. Pearson and the people working with him in those negotiations right up to the signing, they insisted that Article 2 go in there. They weren't going to be satisfied unless it was in, and that's why it got dubbed the Canada Clause. But it really calls NATO to those first principles and directs it into this area of minimizing conflict. So we were surprised that again, the rich history that Canada has in this whole area and how influential Lester B. Pearson was. So that was, it's so inspiring to look back and then be able to we're not calling people to anything new. We're calling them back to first principles. And here they are over and over again. And you see this on the wall in the Diefenbunker and go, Wow, I didn't know that. Anyway, so the Christmas card is, Dear NATO, please, please, please put Canada's claws back in Christmas. It's a bit edgy, but
You read all this stuff with the benefit of history, looking back, and there's been plenty of criticism of Lester B. Pearson, his role in Palestine, and not the history is it's not a straight line. Although they were talking about peace and as the intention, there was, as Eisenhower being the president at the time, understood the power of the military industrial complex, that was a thing even then. And there was, it was a contested space about where the focus should be. And of course, in the Cold War, they were beset by, at that time, Stalin, still in a very expansionist program for the Warsaw Pact countries and the USSR. So they didn't want war, but they could see that as these colonies and principalities that were breaking up and seeking independence were going to get vacuumed up by a very expansionist USSR, and they were very concerned about it. And there was a whole list of countries that had got basically swallowed up. So, you look at them trying to balance this stuff, and we kind of look at it with a jaundiced eye saying, oh, well, they were all about war and they weren't thinking about peace properly and everything. But when you read some of the discussion, like we went back and we found the day of the signing of the NATO treaty, there were the foreign ministers of each of the 10 founding countries, and each of them made a speech at that signing ceremony, along with the Secretary of State of the United States, and along with the President of the United States. And every one of them, there's a goodly signal that the peace is the goal. And so I guess it's just a matter of, how do you get there? And it's like somebody reminded me the other day about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. One of them, I don't know if it's number 1, but it's like, start with a goal in mind. You get a random outcome if you have a random goal. That's sort of where we'd like to see Canada move back to first principles.
If you're in a huge arena of conflict, it is a middle way. So it implies compromise, right? So it's sometimes difficult to get even to first base in dialogue, because when you say the word peace, it has so much baggage. A lot of people immediately dismiss your effort as being some airy-fairy, aspirational moral high ground kind of thing. And yeah, the word is difficult. You have to be careful. But I think like Raja and Jeffrey, would steer people into more useful words like justice. It's a messy business. And Walter Dorn has said that, maybe why we don't invest in it more in this territory is because it's hard. It's hard work. And that's why we're calling for a center. It's the place to house that. And it's also a place that we would envision where an open society can work through things that are difficult and have the freedom to do that.
So just for people that aren't really familiar with that idea, can you describe exactly what you're asking for with the center?
So our parliamentary petition, the wording is we're requesting the government establish a center of excellence for peace and justice. And basically, there's been a couple of programs in the past. There was a Pearson Peace Center that ran for many years. And there was also CIPS, which was the Canadian
Institute of International Peace and Development.
Yeah, and that was a creature of Pierre Trudeau Sr. And those are the most in the past, like that those are the closest to what we're asking for. But what we're basically asking for the government to establish this center, and that it be focused on diplomacy and conflict studies and resolution, and be a tool for government. Number one, that they make a commitment to it, a financial commitment that sort of expresses the importance that it has in the national well-being, because they actually put their own resources into it, but also becomes something that can help the government create policy that is suitable. We don't have anything like that right now. There's a number of conflict resolution studies is a thing in most of the higher learning institutes in Canada, and some of them have separate organizations or think tanks, and some of them may even receive some funding, but it isn't really a national commitment to that model. And it's also, we we're not experts in the technical specifications of that. It's more or less the intention. If the intention is there, it can be built. If the intention is correct, getting back to these first principles, then there's lots of people around who are much more knowledgeable and expert in what the pitfalls would be and the costs and building that model. And we're basically just trying to start the discussion with government about it. And I think one of the things that we talked about was this idea that political parties, which when they're what would it be like a party position, isn't necessarily always the only thing that an MP will be thinking about. Like they have their own values, their own history. And I just wanted to read, this was an email we received from a conservative MP. You might have heard this already I did refer to it a couple of times from the public events. But he wrote, we got this email the same evening after the reception. It came to us at like 11 at night on my email. And it was, Keith and Bernadette, I wanted to send a note of thanks to you for all the hard work of organizing an idea into a concrete action that became the peace train that spoke to so many of us here in Ottawa and in your stops across this beautiful country. You saw that yourselves as more MPs than at almost every other reception that I have the honor and privilege of attending came last night to hear what this idea of peace is and can be. And those MPs represented the full cross-section of our people's parliament and political philosophy, while my fellow MPs that spoke represented the various paths to peace that are evident in the vocations we choose. The goal was the same, peace in our world. So again, thank you for living out your ideals in this concrete world that we all share. It is you that inspire us, not the other way around. So, that was basically that was the goal, that was the payoff, right? Like to get that kind of message from an opposition MP
It's very encouraging.
at a time when the rhetoric and conflicted, emotions within our federal governance is so ridiculous. To get this from a conservative MP, it was like, in my mind, it was like, well, mission accomplished. That was what we wanted to do, to develop a conversation with people who might not be on the, sort of on our side or whatever. Like to have that kind of response, it was so meaningful to me because we were saying, what we want to come home with relationships. That's what we want to go to Ottawa for. Let's develop some relationships, some dialogue. And when we come home, we're still there. Like mentally, we're still engaged with those people. And and so that's really, it was very sobering in a way. And that was the thing. Going to Ottawa, it was like, what kind of country do we live in that we can do, like a bunch of little ordinary people at the very margins of our country can come to this capital and have this kind of reception, in general, like to be received with such generosity of spirit and actually talk to people that nobody's talking to each other. And we were like, it was so amazing. I was so like, we're so lucky to live in this place that is possible.
Yeah, and I would add about the Peace Center. We know we're not experts, although we're advised by experts. And we will continue to shape ideas and hopes around a center of peace and justice. But I've often thought in my mind, what would be the litmus test of one that was operating well? And probably at the top of my list is clarity, honesty, and rigor addressing the causes and conditions of conflict, and setting a mindset, like getting a mindset and a discipline around that. And as Keith says, to have this kind of dynamic constantly linked to the government and interchanging. And, that's a mystery to me, how you would orchestrate that. But that it would have this rigor in that kind of analysis, but also provide checks and balances on the government's behavior and its policies and, calling it back to first principles. So, that's why we need a center like that. It looks like that CIPS, the Canadian Institute of International Peace and Security, was a good model. So we do have models and aspects of successes in the past to incorporate in an idea like that. But everybody we talked to, including all of our expert advisors, thought it was a good idea. Nobody said, "Oh no, we don't need that," or "That's not really the right way to go," or anything. So we'll just keep going with the flow and see how it develops.
Just to take that back a little bit more, this idea of the Peace Center came up right in the beginning of our deliberations, because one of the first things we did when we started talking about the peace train was, we went to the internet and we came up with the 2019 report from the Standing Committee on National Defense, and the theme of that report was Canada as a peace builder. And what kept coming up within those 98 pages, which was, this huge document that we waded through, right at the beginning of our work, was that there are experts that were speaking to that panel. They were saying we need a center of excellence. We need to be looking at justice as well as peace. Like Bernadette said, then when we started talking to our advisors, they were right on with that as well. So we knew we were on the right track.
Well, it was one of their main recommendations to the government was to establish a peace center again, because we had lost our centers. The report was incredible and the expert witness in it was incredible, but historically it's been lost to the current government. So the government should have responded to this report, but an election was called. And all kinds of things fall through the cracks when something like that happens. It's quite shocking. So much work, so much excellent work going into a report like that, and it just is lost. But there are people that will call us back to those pre-existing gifts that we have. And that's all we need to do is call people back to what was already there.
Yeah, so that standing committee report fell because it was tabled, and then before the government responded to it as they should have, an election was called. So our petition is in the same precarious state right now. Yeah. It was presented in the House on the 19th of November, the day before we arrived there. It's all in good order. It's now tabled, and the government, under the petition regs, it has 45 days to respond. So January 3rd is the 45-day mark, but the government doesn't have to respond until the House sits again, which is on the 27th of January, I think. So if the government falls or an election is called before the 27th of January, our petition will be null. And, in order to revive the electronic petition, we'd have to go back and start the process again, and with a new government, whichever stripe that is. But so we're really hoping the current government won't, commit hara-kiri here in a fit of angst. And but my feeling is they'll try to hang on and fulfill the final 25% of their mandate, which why wouldn't they? We'll see what happens.
Well, there's a lot of really encouraging things to hear here. I'm wondering, for people that want to support you, that want to know what they can do to push their MP to not let it get dropped and not let it get fall through the cracks, how can we help you as regular citizens?
MP.
One of the things that we're really moving into right now is, in addition to the electronic petition that we did, we also have a paper petition, a hard copy for people to actually sign with a pen. And what we're going to be trying to do over the next few weeks and months is, the ultimate goal would be to get every riding in this country to present a petition, our petition, to their MP, because we feel that by writing a petition, all those people that signed the petition, they've become aware of the project, of the Center of Excellence and what we're proposing. And when they take it to their MP, the MP becomes aware that he or she has all these constituents that are in favor of this thing. And then the next step is that the MP is more or less compelled to present his or her people's petition in the House, whether he or she agrees with it or not. And so we feel that with this show of support and strength across the country, that maybe we have a better chance of reaching our objective. So yes, I think if people are interested in helping us with the petition, they should be contacting us. And I don't know, Keith, what do you think would be the best way? I mean, we've obviously got the website.
The website would be the place to go. And there is instruction about the petition, and there's also.
But I just need to interject to say that the part of the symbolism of the train, the small number in many ways, just 40 Canadians on the train going right across the country, symbolized a huge, a number of other people that came in spirit. And so we call the people that got on the train peace trainers, but the other ones were tracking with us, and we call them train trackers. So if anyone wants to be a train tracker, just contact us. We'll put you on that list. And then as things come up, which they will, that people can really help us with, we'll just tell them and keep them up to date on developments as we go forward in 2025.
Yeah, so if you go on our website, there is a place there where you can sign up to be a tracker. So, basically, and then you email us so it's peacetraincanada.com, www.peacetraincanada.com. Yeah, that's the point of entry, and there's lots of information on the website too. Documentary, background reference material that talks about, a lot of the related issues like we've been talking about. Yeah.
And the active Peace Train Canada blog spot, if you just type that in, it pops up and it's got lots of information about especially about the trip across Canada and now developments since we've come home.
Well, that's really cool. I'm really thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? Any anecdotes or anything else you're thinking?
No, but thank you so much for organizing this conversation. I think is really helpful.
I'd just like to share one of the little stories that we got within our group, and what it was that the clergy from Canadian Memorial United Church, Kathy Merchant, she brought her husband, her two small children, and her father. They all came on the train. And one of the things that happened, she has this young daughter, and the daughter said to Kathy one day, she said, "Is Keith just an ordinary person?" And she said, "Yes, he's just an ordinary person." And it was just so beautiful, because what it said is that ordinary people can do really extraordinary things, and like Keith likes to say, we have agency, we have agency to do things in this world, and we're just ordinary.
Working with CKCU has helped me to learn that so much. She's going to remember that. That's going to probably be a turning point in her young life, just to realize that we do have agency. It might not be easy. It's a lot of work, but ordinary people are often what get things done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, yeah.
Good note.
Well, thank you, Nathaniel.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
I did see that you
Any
did.
other questions or?
Nice to see everybody. Congratulations for what you're doing. It's so positive. It's so good. And I'm sure the results are beyond what you're aware of. The spin-off results of your visit here and just the whole idea of what you've done. And so every time I sing that song, for example, I tell people what you did, and I can see the light bulbs going off. Wow, they did that. Maybe I could do something.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
Way to
that's
go.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. So nice to see you guys.
Yeah, really nice.